Hi, everybody. Welcome to the HOPECAST. This is David Dwight, and I'm really happy to be hosting today. And I have my good friend, Chris Rhoden, who's joining me in the studio today. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation with Chris. And for those of you who may not know Chris, I'm really looking forward to being able to introduce a friend to friends, which is always a fun thing to do in life. The HOPECAST is from Hope Church in Richmond, Virginia, and it's a place where we want to have sincere conversations about faith and life and lots of the things that come with both. And so welcome. We're glad you're here. So I want to tell you just a bit about our background. I first met Chris when he was on our staff at Hope Church. He had come on staff to work in our small group ministry. And we met one morning at a staff meeting. Today's Wednesday, and it was a Wednesday because that's when all staff are together. And I had a chance to meet Chris, and that was fun. And I was just going to chat. We were just going to chat for a minute afterwards, sort of say hi and welcome aboard. And I think it was about an hour later that we realized we had pinged on a lot of stuff. So, so glad to be together today. Thank you for being willing to be here to share your heart. I want to give you I'm trying to think of what the right kind of wording would be. Chris is a very thoughtful person with a deep articulated faith, and you're going to get a glimpse of all of that, and we'll talk more about a host of things that connect with that. So that's enough of my setup and my intro. Welcome. Really glad you're here.
Thank you, David. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you introduce yourself in any way you want to introduce yourself to people?
Sure. Maybe start off with how I ended up maybe kind of sitting in this chair. And we're not going to go back to the very, very beginning. But I have been fortunate enough to have, in some ways, lived a number of different lives. I grew up in the Midwest. We're not going to go through all that. Did a career as a naval officer. Went to work for the federal government as a civil servant down in Norfolk. And had some life events kind of change things and kind of redirect the direction I was going. And I'm sure we may talk about this a little bit, but and the long and the short of it was a pretty dramatic shift in where I was. Richmond was this place that you kind of drove through on the way up to D.C. Spent a lot of time in D.C., between D.C. and Norfolk. Never thought I'd end up here, and ended up through a long series of very unexpected circumstances out on the Appalachian Trail, coming through, ended up meeting a woman here in Richmond. A couple years or a year later, I moved up to Richmond. She's attending Hope, so that seemed like a really good reason to come to Hope. So I came to Hope, and then
a lot of people go to church with ulterior motives. You know that.
I do know that. I mean, for sure. We'll
take them any way we can get them.
Yes. And it's so funny. We just had this conversation with a friend the other day. And Catherine and I are out on the beach one day down in Virginia Beach, and she goes, well, I just want you to know, we have to have this conversation right now. If this is going to go anywhere, faith is really important to me. Is faith really important to you? And I'm going, yes, it is. Of course it's important to me. Uh-huh. And I had no idea what I was saying at that point. Uh-huh. I had grown up in the church, but it wasn't this. It wasn't, and I don't mean this church. I mean, it was just a different experience.
Yeah.
And so, 6 months later, I'm up here and I'm meeting Tuck Nup at Starbucks over in Gayton Crossing, and just having coffee is all it was. And before you know it, like, hey, we have an opening on the staff. And kind of, as you said, we ended up, I will never forget that conversation. And we can talk about as much of that or as little of that as you want. And it kind of led into the next step at Lola's that you had talked about.
Lola's is a nearby restaurant where Chris and I took our after the staff meeting conversation to a next follow-up conversation. That was about a 2.5 hour lunch that day.
Yep. Yeah. So when I came up here, the intent was to start a counseling practice. And so I was finishing up my degree at...
the intent was to pursue Catherine.
Well, it was, yes. That's true. If you look underneath everything, of course, that's what it was.
The truth meter is spiking in here a little bit.
Well, part of that, I don't know if that was even part of the plan, but I was attending VCU while I was on staff here, and kind of transitioned over into doing private practice therapy.
Yeah.
And So left the staff, set up a little practice over at Laurel Presbyterian Church, which is a church in Laurel, obviously, and did that for a couple of years. And then, it's just been incredible and good and everything else. But recently had kind of a medical thing that kind of shifted the plan a little bit. And so here's where we are now. That's how I got here.
There's so much meaningful content for us to talk about. So if it's okay, I'm gonna fill in some of my perspective on all of this. So Chris is a humble person, but I think you heard him say, okay, so I had a career as a naval officer. So when I met Chris and I learned that, I'm like, okay, that's really interesting and engaging. And I've got lots of questions and curiosities about, what does a career as a naval officer mean? And then civil service, then working on staff in small groups while pursuing a degree in counseling, and then taking the step, once you had that degree, to be a professional counselor. And also deep water in your personal life. So you mentioned some deep personal experiences in your Norfolk years. So Chris has a daughter named Abby, and Abby experienced a journey with cancer, and Abby is heavenward, and she's no longer with us. And so you have lots of memories of deep and poignant experiences as a father, loving and caring for her. You have other children. You have two boys.
I do.
And I'm just saying this so people understand the landscape. You married Catherine a couple of years after Abby died. And so there's lots of meaningful fabric in all of this. So when Chris and I met, this is after the staff meeting, we were chatting, and I said, just tell me a little bit about you. So if I remember correctly, you said you were an English major in college.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm like, okay, there's a naval officer who's an English major, so he's a literary word guy. So I'm like thinking, that's fun. I like those kind of conversations. And then you threw a curveball because you said, then you got a master's in math.
Yes.
And I was like, a master's in math? Like, who's an English major and then gets a master's in math? So that opened a whole new category of conversations for us. And then I think I was asking you about the Navy and what's it like in your career and captaining a ship and so on and so forth. I have a funny memory one day. You'd been on staff, I don't know, maybe 6 months, and we had enjoyed getting to know each other. And I was in my office one day, and I think you knocked on the door, and you said something like, permission to enter? And I was like, what? And we were laughing about that. And you were like, I think that just sort of flowed out of your, naval career.
Right.
And, I wanted to be real official, yes, sir, permission granted, or something like that. We've talked about and we've connected on, I don't know, you have different friends. And one of the things my wife Elizabeth and I talk about a lot is one of the beauties of friendships is you can have one friend and you have such beautiful connections on certain lanes and topics of life.
Right.
And then you have another friend and the lanes and the topics are different with that friend. And it's just one of the things you're so grateful for your friends.
Yeah.
You and I connect on a lot of lanes and topics. I think some people might think some of those lanes and topics are pretty abstract. To you and I think when we ping on these, we feel like we found our person. Like nobody I've ever met wants to talk about this, and you want to talk about this.
Exactly right. No,
right?
Yes.
So Chris is a deep, thoughtful person, and it's so fun to me when we have conversations about stuff. A sidebar we'll come back to later. Chris writes and posts regularly in his journey, but his life, his reflections, his faith in Substack, but other ways that comes out. If you want to read what Chris posts, you can get the Substack app and you can find Chris Rhoden through that Substack. Chris's entries to me are remarkable. There are times where I open them and I read the first paragraph and I'm like, I'm not in the headspace to read this and really take it in because I know it's going to be really deep and thoughtful and I can't give it its due in the midst of a busy day. So I'll come back to it later. So let me start by asking this. You said you had a church background, but then you used a phrase and you said something like, but that was nothing like this. So what was that and what is this?
Okay. I really appreciate that. I grew up, and I'm really, really grateful for the way in which I grew up. I was the guy, I have a friend, we used to talk about how we were the only kids in America who went to church like every day, and we kind of really did go to church every day. I laughed with Pete a couple weeks ago where he said, but I'm not even exaggerating, by the age of 6, I could explain to you I don't know if the right word is theology or the doctrine of penal substitution. I could do it. I could explain the whole thing to you. I'm 6 years old. And so very early on in my life, I was given the language of Christianity. I knew the rules. I knew the lanes. I knew the way it was supposed to go. And I could explain it, I think. And I kind of thought that was the whole thing. And again, I'm grateful for that upbringing, but I think what I was taught is I was taught a lot about Jesus and I was taught a lot about Christ. But I think we know this. I mean, the difference between knowing about Christ and knowing Christ, the gap between those two things is enormous. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I understood that. And it was when I came here.
In a sense, how could you understand it if you haven't experienced the other side of the gap? Right? How could you understand it?
No, that's right. Of course.
Okay, sorry I interrupted. So you came here.
I got to pause a little bit and just think about that. But because I think we've talked about this, right?
Is there anything we haven't talked about?
Well, I mean, look, I'm just going to say this, and I don't know if they edit or not, but like the David Foster Wallace thing. I think I sent this to you, like the fish. There's the story about the old fish and the 2 young fish. Have you heard this story? Mm-hmm. And the old fish goes to the 2 young fish, how's the water? And they keep swimming away. And then they look at each other and go, what is water anyway? Like they had no idea because they're in it and they just don't know. You have to kind of
Wasn't it a graduation speech he gave? It became like super famous.
Yes. Yeah. So
if you don't know who David Foster Wallace is, just Google him and you'll find some cool stuff.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you're right. You have to get out of something to understand what you're in or to see that there's something different. I think that's a really good way of thinking of it. So we come up here, and I don't know if you know this. When I first started attending the church here, you were on sabbatical. I think you were, yeah. And so, so like my introduction to Hope is I'm coming in with Catherine, and we're over in the overflow, and I'm standing beside her, and like they're singing, and I'll lean in to hear her sing. But there was Pete was there pretty often. Yeah, and I know it's his catchphrase, but I mean, it was like something I'd never heard before. And it really kind of like caught in my ear every time I hear it. Like you go nowhere by accident. Right. And like you start paying attention. And so that was kind of my introduction. And then I don't know if you remember, but I mean.
You probably loved the church. And then I got back from sabbatical and you're like, oh, Catherine, I'm so disappointed. What happened? I really liked it. He's the regular preacher. And I don't know if it was, I honestly have no idea, but it's like there's a handful of sermons that I kind of latch onto and I remember. And one of them was pretty early on and it was about fear. And there were 2 of them that would kind of stick out in my mind. The first time when I came here, it was the first time I ever heard Thomas referred to compassionately. And it was something that really touched me. Before we started this podcast, we talked about doubt and love. And like how important I think doubt and love are, and both of them are important. Mm-hmm. And to hear, that was just not something that we talked about in the church I grew up in. Like doubt was something that was kind of shameful and something to keep hidden away from everybody. And like this like idea of Jesus not like waving his finger at Thomas, but like holding out his hand and saying, here, take a look. You can touch it. I mean, here, I want you to see this. Put your fingers in my side, he says to him.
Yes.
Put them in. Like, can you imagine that moment? Put your fingers inside my body.
I mean, it's stunning to me. And there's no shame. There's no like, what's wrong with you? How can you not believe this? You've been with me for all this time and you can't believe? I mean, what's wrong with you? It's like, no, I'll meet you where you are.
Right.
Come. And that was dramatically different. And then the and again, I mean, I'm really glad I had that structure. I don't want to hear anybody hear anything different. I mean, the structure was super important. But the second thing, and I don't know if this was right after, I don't know when it was. It was it was before COVID was a thing. It was when COVID was kind of like brewing over in China.
Okay, so late in the year of 2019.
Yes. And I can remember you, I mean, let's just say it was you, standing up in front of the church saying, this fear has got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Just pleading with the people in the church, we've got to let go of this fear. And it touched a place, look, part of it's what I was doing at the time, right? Because I was doing therapy and like it just resonated so deeply, this idea of, I mean, most of the people with whom I deal are trapped in that place of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I think this is of course what you meant, whether this was explicitly what you were intending or not, I mean, there's an invitation there. You can't just say, stop being afraid. I mean, that's just kind of silly, right? I mean, the implication is there's a way for this fear to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so it got my attention.
Mm-hmm.
It got my attention. And so that is what I think is different because honestly, the church, I don't want to say it that way. There was a lot of fear where I grew up. Like, don't get outside the lines. Don't stray outside the lines. You stray outside the lines and you're in trouble. You're in trouble, mister. God's just waiting for you to get outside and I'm going to smack you down. And this was a not completely different. It was a different part of God that was revealed. Maybe I'll say it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. My guess is there are many people who can resonate with what you're hearing. I just want to timestamp a little bit. So you're talking about sort of late in the year 2019. Mm-hmm. You're relatively new in Richmond.
Right.
You've been at Hope that's interesting because I can look back at my own life and remember, 2019, I was on sabbatical late August into November. When did your daughter Abby die?
She died in December 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're not even a year after she passed away as you're sharing all this. I'm hoping people can bear with me. I'm trying to arrange this because I think as people hear your story more, they'll appreciate these things as they know how things have happened in your life in the last 6-7 years. Okay. So when we had the first lunch, we started talking about math. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not really a math guy. I'm not really gifted in math, but I am sort of philosophical. I love philosophy and I love ideas and what happens when you take this idea to its next place? And then what about the next place after that? Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? And then what does that lead to? And you had a way of describing, I think you said something like, I'm not sure that math and philosophy are as different as you might think they are.
Right.
And then I was like, can you say more about that? So I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
So I don't, what I remember the conversation, like partly you kind of like stubbed your toe on the English to math transition.
Yeah. I'm like, how could one person be geeky on both of those things? You usually meet like quant jocks who are math and science people, or you meet like word jocks who are literature, word, philosophy people. It's very rare that a person geeks on both of those lanes, and you do.
I do. I don't know what that says. We'll have a different conversation about that.
This makes you a leopard with stripes. You're a very unusual animal.
So at least from my perspective, I mean, what do you do with math? What you do with math is you describe the universe. You describe the world that you see. You use math to do it. What do you do with language?
What I do with math is wish it away. When I was in school, that's what I did with it.
Yeah, but it's
just say that again, right? Because I think if people hear that, now maybe I'm speaking of this as a person who, I get all the normal math stuff, right? I get all the basics. But when you get into sophisticated math, I start realizing I don't understand what's happening with the numbers and the sophisticated things that these numbers are doing. But I do understand philosophy. And you were sort of saying the sophisticated thing these numbers are doing are describing the universe. And I'm like, that works for me.
Yeah.
And I totally get the concept of something describing the universe. But never before you said that had I ever thought math describes the universe.
It's so funny you say this. So I taught mathematics down at ODU for a little while, and I'd have these conversations with the other professors. Like, it's the best job in the world. If you ever get the opportunity to be an adjunct somewhere, take it, because you're kind of bulletproof. You can do anything you want to do. It's like so much fun. But I have these conversations with the other professors, and there's a lot of time we'd spend talking about whether mathematics is discovered or invented. And it's a dramatically different perspective. Like, on the one hand, if it's discovered, then there's something fundamentally true about mathematics, and it's our quest to discover all the things.
Okay, I just have to interject, because please forgive me if you're a math person, you're like, David, just be quiet, let him talk. If you're not really a math person, but you have philosophical gleanings, just the phrase, is math discovered or invented, right? That's a huge question.
Yeah.
If it's discovered, it exists. And we've just sort of had our awareness open to its existence.
Right.
If it's invented, it doesn't empirically or existentially exist on its own. We've created numbers and symbols and invented it, right?
Yes.
Now, I think I know where you're going to go on those two, but can you keep going? But I don't know. If you're not a math person, I'm trying to help you, because I'm not a math person the way Chris is. Okay.
And people feel pretty strongly about this question. They feel you're not surprised, right?
Right.
And it's funny. I have a conversation with my nephew who's in Ohio, really a brilliant young man. He's like 23. I guess he just turned 24. And he's absolutely convinced that truth, capital T truth, is mathematical. And of course, you know where I'm going with this. I don't think so at all. I think we get to describe, just as we might find English is a really good language for describing certain things, or we were talking ahead of time, like maybe, Spanish is something good for something else. We just find the right language to describe what it is that we see, the world that we live in.
Right.
So to me, it's almost, I really want to hold space for the other perspective on this, but it's really hard for me to wrap my head around the idea that math is anything other than something that we invent. And my proof of it is...
Wait. Say it again. It's hard?
Yeah.
You're saying we invent math.
I think we do.
Okay.
I think we do.
Can you say a couple more sentences about that? What do you mean when you say that?
I think that when we come up against something that we can't describe, we come up with a way to describe it. I think it's just almost as simple as that.
Okay.
And if you look at the history of math... you want to talk about math for the rest of the time? I was thinking about this on the way over. And I'll give you, for instance, okay?
Yeah.
For the longest time, all we had were whole numbers. That's all we had.
Right.
And you can go back and look at the history of mathematics.
Right.
And then somebody said, oh, that's not enough. There's numbers in between the numbers, and numbers were just abstractions.
So there's a middle ground between 1 and 2, and it's 1.5.
Yeah.
For example.
Yes. And so somebody kind of said, well, we need a way to represent that. So we came up with this idea of rational numbers. And so everybody goes, okay, great. We got this figured out. Rational numbers is just one whole number over another number. This sounds really funny that we're talking about this here, but so we realized we had a whole and a way of describing the world. So we came up with a different way of describing the world.
Right.
Well, it turns out that like you think we got it all covered, right? We got rational numbers, and like we have this conversation often about like if you had the number line right up there, and you threw a dart, right? You're going to hit a rational number, right? A number divided by another number, guaranteed you're going to hit, right? The probability of you hitting a rational number is 0. It's 0.
Because it doesn't actually exist as a rational number.
Because
you can't hit it that finely tuned.
Because we have a lot of irrational numbers. There are a lot, like a whole lot of numbers that cannot be represented by a ratio. And what you find out is that you have countable infinities and you have uncountable infinities, and we are totally geeking out.
Yeah,
we are. But it's really this beautiful idea. Like countable infinity is one thing. Uncountable is something completely different. And in the context of mathematics on the number line, the relative density of the irrational numbers is infinitely more than the rational numbers, which means on a number line, all of the rational numbers collapse to a single point, a single dimensionless point.
A single dimensionless point.
A single dimensionless point.
Okay.
So what does that mean? It means literally if I throw a dart at a number line, I will not hit a rational number, even though there's infinitely many of them.
Okay. So I'm sympathetic with your nephew who says math describes truth because it's his best effort to try to get to truth with what he understands, with what the tools are that he has. So I'm always sympathetic to the earnest seeker.
Yes.
You're saying we invented math. We invented these things we call numbers, which are various dashboard measurements and indicators to try to describe truths that exist.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the truths exist. We didn't invent the truths.
No.
We just invented math like a ruler. It's like a way to measure something. The measurement was already there before we measured it. We just invented the tool to try to find a way to measure it. Right?
Really, yes. A beautiful way of saying it. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
so sorry, everybody, but this is where Chris and I start geeking out. So how about lots of people would say, let's talk about God. Is God discovered or invented? Right? And you use the phrase with math, people feel strongly about this. Okay, so in this church context, if we just threw out for the fun of the conversation, is God discovered or invented? My guess is people would hear that and they might have some strong feelings about it, right? So I'm going to say he's discovered because God exists, God is true, and we grow to discover the truth of who God is. But I'm also sympathetic to the person who would want to say, no, I think he's invented. And I would say, what do you mean by that? And somebody would say, you know what? I think God is something human beings made up to try to assuage their doubts, fears, unknowns about life. I would have said that at a certain time in my life. I would have absolutely said that.
Right.
And I would have said the number of different religions that are out there just would reinforce my argument about that. In other words, nobody really knows. There's just a whole bunch of people who are trying to figure out ways to describe the unknowns and the big questions about life. Nobody really knows. So lots of groups of people have taken stabs at creating some philosophical religious ideas to come up with what they call a God concept, a supreme being, a bigger than, a great spirit in the sky. And so they invent religion, right? What I'm talking about right now is very much a part of my own spiritual journey.
Right.
And there would have been a time in my life if somebody said to me, what do you think about God? Is he discovered or invented? I would have said he's invented. Human beings make up the God idea, and all the different religions just reaffirm that people are taking stabs at this, and these are the different efforts, but nobody really knows. It's only till you get to go back where we were, to another side of seeing things very differently, that you're now like, ooh, wow, now I really see things very differently. Because at this stage of life, I would say God is discovered. God exists as the Lord of all, who is true, who is his own self-existent reality. And we end up discovering who God is. And we grow through a lifetime of faith and learning. But this question about invented or discovered, that's pretty cool. So can I open the concept of time?
Yes.
So at our lunch at Lola's, like the famous lunch at Lola's, we're basically kind of doing what we did at lunch at Lola's that day. And so I asked you, do you think time exists? And then we got into a conversation about what is time? Mm-hmm. How do you measure time? So we have watches, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. Your watch isn't time.
No.
It's only a tool that we invented to try to find our location in the thing we've decided to call time. God is eternal. He's outside of time. He doesn't live in time, in its confinements. So does time actually exist? Well, then we got into time actually has an intersection with physics, which has to do with light and motion. Mm-hmm. And light and motion are component elements to how we, quote, measure what we call time, right? So then we got into Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there was morning and evening the first day. Mm-hmm. And he created the moon and the star and the sun. And there was morning and evening. So we've got light, we've got motion, and we've got what we might call movement, right? So now we're into this question of time. Mm-hmm. So is time invented or discovered?
This is so fun that we're going here.
I know, and I'm so afraid that we're the only two having fun with this, that anybody listening to it is like, did you listen to that podcast with David Dwight and Chris Rhoden? Oh, dude, I turned it off in 8 minutes. Like, anyway. Okay.
I will tell you, my conception of time has changed a lot since you and I had that conversation, I think. Okay. And at least to me, and I'm stealing this phrase from you, this is a thought in progress, and will probably continue to be a thought in progress for a while. Mm-hmm. I think of measurable time as just a little hint of capital T time, or what some people call deep time.
Deep time?
Deep time.
Okay.
And like, if we go back to the rational numbers and the real numbers, like to me, measurable time is that dimensionless point on the number line. Mm-hmm. But time is real. I think time is real. I think that, I think eternity is real. I really do. I think it's a real thing. I don't know what that means.
What's the difference between time and eternity? Or what's compare and contrast? You use those.
I think what we get to see is, again, just that little tiny little dot on the number line.
Okay.
I do. I think that's all we get to see.
Okay.
But there's enough, like maybe it's a shadow of what real capital T time, deep time is. And so I think there's enough hints. I think you and I have talked about this before. Like there's enough things that we see every day that suggest that, I'm just going to say it, the depth and the breadth and the enormity of God's love. We can't see the whole thing, but you hear, you get up in the morning, you hear bird song. Like, is that the whole thing? Of course not. But man, it gives you a little peek into something that is just so beautiful. And to me, like that's what measurable time is. And there's something that's just stunningly beautiful about measurable time. But it's just a hint of something so much bigger.
So now my brain is on to something like this. If God created everything, if God loves us beyond our wildest dreams, and our fullest life is eternity with Him, then everything He's created that we experience is a gift from Him to us to enhance our capacity to experience the enormously bursting love and joy of heaven. And so that means everything we're talking about here is a gift from God to us that we might have foretastes. And just as we're not in heaven, like we've had a little sub-theme here, which is I wouldn't have known that until I was on the other side. We're saying this, and I think you and I agree with it, but we also know, but we can't fully know what that means, what it actualizes into until we're on the other side. Mm-hmm. But we're like both very confident that this principle is in play. So everything from time to math to the song of a bird in the morning is a gift from God so that we can have our preparations and joys prepared for the fullest experience that is with him forever.
Yeah, I'm convinced. I mean, I'm really convinced. I mean, everything. Like everything. When I say everything, like I think of our senses.
Our what? Our senses. Yes, yes.
Like our bodies.
Yes.
Like this idea, like we have souls and we have bodies, and I go, it's just like nonsensical. I mean, I don't want to say it's nonsensical. I cannot wrap my head around that.
Right.
Like you, David, you, Chris, were given a body.
Right.
You're given the ability to hear that bird song. You were given the ability to feel that cold, cool air. You were given vision. You were given all these things. And like, if you can imagine, if you can hold your mouth just right and go like all that stuff, you get to taste that glass of red wine and it's exquisite.
Right.
If you can just imagine for a second that like this is God saying, here's just a little sample.
Totally. So here, Chris, this we're going to start getting emotional in a minute, I can tell. So if our bodies are this kind of a gift from God, which are a gift from your loving Father in heaven, so that you can experience life for a time, and this body is a means by which we can experience many aspects of beauty and richness. But they're just a tiny little snippet. They're just one of these tiny little pre-heaven gifts for us. One of the things that this makes me think of is, wow, what if we really, really could embrace feeling that this is what my body is? So many people are at war with their body.
Oh, goodness. Yes.
There is such mental, internal turmoil and anguish about how do I look? What do I look like? I feel like I'm overweight. There's this internal churn. And so I think, like a lot of things, once we start realizing we're in a fallen world, something that God designed to be such a beautiful gift, sadly gets contorted into something that we have an antagonistic relationship with, right? And that is like, oh man, could we recover a little bit of the realization that these bodies are just such exquisite gifts from God as pre-taste gifts for us, rather than something that we're all battling with and we're thinking, I've got new wrinkles and I'm upset about it and all that.
Okay, I'm going to be on very thin ice here. So if I start getting out too far in the lake, you can say, come on back, Chris. That's okay.
Okay.
To me,
the opinions expressed on this show are neither the held by the church or the whatever.
No, but I mean, like when I read the story of the fall, like I used to think that, and I was told, and I think there's truth in this, but there's a deeper truth. The sin was in the disobedience. That's what I was told. And I don't think so. I think the temptation and like the mastery of the divider was to say, what you have is not good enough.
Right.
It wasn't a gift that's worthy of God. So you've got to do better. You've got to make up for this. Yeah. And that's like a completely different way of looking at it for me. And it's just been perpetuated now for that's the story, right?
I can easily tie those threads together. I don't know if everybody feels comfortable with that. If sin, let's call it the more punitive thing, you didn't trust God, right? Okay. At some level, it's true. They didn't trust God.
Yes.
There was something going on with them that made them susceptible to the temptation that God was not enough. And probably there was the seed possibility of the fear that could be capitalized on, that as we have that story, the tempter tries to put the dagger into that little seed potentiality of fear and get people start thinking about it. And then they start operating out of fear rather than out of love and trust. And so that means that out of that fear, we don't trust one way or another that God is enough,
Right.
and that we somehow have to take this under our own dominion.
Yes.
And the result is, the scriptures say they were afraid, right? And this is interesting that we're back to you coming to Hope Church and this topic of fear and how does fear come into life.
And at least to me, to kind of, at least in my mind, to kind of close the loop on this, like the idea that we would be distrustful of the gifts that God gives us is heartbreaking. I mean, it's just like the fear thing. Like, how many people do I know? So many people who, and I mean people of faith and people I love and admire and everything, and I get it. And me too, often, let's be honest, me too, often, that like live in a world that they just don't trust. They just can't trust. They can't trust that there's beauty and there's goodness, and their focus is always on being alert and being hyper vigilant and being ready for the next shoe to drop. And I get it. I mean, I do.
There's a million reasons that people would have that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But to turn that around and say, no, we live, I think we've used these terms together, you and I, like we live in a God-soaked world. I'm not saying that this is the kingdom that's going to be realized in the eternity. I don't believe that at all.
Right.
But that doesn't mean God has abandoned us. He just hasn't. I mean, and if so, and then I think then I'm just missed the whole point of everything.
So this makes me think, what if I'm going to use some words here, our internal psyche and our faith could move a little bit out of fear and move a little bit more into the reality of God's redeeming love. Henry Nouwen's way of saying this is, the journey of the Christian life is the long process of moving out of the house of fear and into the house of love, which, oh my gosh, we could talk about that forever. You should know, Chris and I have in mind what we haven't mentioned. We're getting ready to take a trip together next week where we're going to have some retreat days together. So I think we're realizing everything we're talking about today, we're going to get to really go further on it. Could you say a word on that? I do want to talk a little bit about some of your personal journey, because your way of encountering this current health issue is powerful, beautiful, filled with faith, and I think could really help a lot of people to hear it.
Okay.
If you're okay with that. One step before that, though, could you comment on this? Like, this life of faith is growing out of the house of fear and growing into the house of love?
So when you said that, it reminded me, so one of the people that I like to read is Rohr, and he wrote this book called Falling Upward. Richard Rohr. Mm-hmm. And there's a book called Falling Upward, and he describes it. It's very simple. I say simplistic. It's Richard Rohr. It's not simplistic, but it's this idea that we like live our lives in two halves. And the first half is where we strive and we try really hard to stay inside the lines, and we're working toward status and wealth.
Trying to be good enough.
Mm-hmm. And this resonates deeply with me, this idea that like, that's really an important part of the process. It's really important that we do that, because what ends up happening is we build this beautiful structure. We build this big giant castle on a cliff somewhere, and we think we're good. And then this storm blows, and it just knocks everything right to the ground.
That castle and everything we did to build it gets disbodied.
Yes.
In a life quake.
Yes. And then you have a choice, and then we have a choice. And people do both. And some people go, well, obviously I didn't build the foundation strong enough. I messed up. I didn't do it well enough. And so they double down on their own efforts. And they go to work and they dig the foundation 12 foot deeper, and they do all the other things, and they build another castle.
And the fortress is bigger and higher.
And then another storm, another life quake.
Yeah.
And that's the process. It repeats until at some point you realize it's time to walk out of that house of fear. And you just abandon it and you leave it behind and you walk out into the house of love. So this Nouwen Rohr thing, like I never would have made that connection, but I mean, that's kind of what I heard. And, and it resonates, this idea. And to me, there comes a point, and this is kind of a nice segue, I think, like where you have no choice. Like you can keep trying and you can keep striving and you can keep trying to build a better and better and better. But you realize you're just wearing yourself out.
You keep experiencing the tyrannies of what fear is doing to your life.
Yeah.
So we like to be sympathetic to the person who's not a faith person who has doubts, and I love those conversations. I want to be sympathetic to the faith person who could get uncomfortable with a conversation like this.
Okay.
And some people might hear a conversation like this and think, well, wait, if I go too far with what you guys are talking about, I have no true Christian, biblical, religious clarity, right? Like, oh no, we're on the edge of jumping off into an abyss where everybody makes up their own God. What I would want to say is that's not where we're trying to go. It's not where we're heading. It's actually having the right clarities of who God is that then give us the freedoms to enter his love, right? So here, let's use the word doctrine. You talked about doctrine when you were a kid. And doctrine and how we experience it and what it grows up to be in our lives can take lots of different forms for lots of different people for a million different reasons. I think psychology studies and stuff like this would say most people are wired to want to be given clarities, which in religion usually turns into rules. And so most people are more comfortable religiously with rules. So what I would want to say is, let's not call it so much rules. I get rules, and I understand that, and I appreciate it. But let's say more truths.
Okay, yes.
So if we have certain truths, we'll call them doctrine, about who God is and who human beings are and so on, the truths give us the clarities to be able to experience the freedoms of God's love. If we don't have any truth, we have no clarity, freedom means nothing, and love kind of means nothing. If we understand who God truly is, then we will want to live truly in him, experience the freedom that truth gives us, and be released into the enormous magnitude of his love. So I'm trying to be thoughtful. So if a person is like, you guys are talking so philosophically that it makes me think you're getting way out of the camp in terms of Christian doctrine, that's not where we're headed. You mentioned a poem, maybe we can read it before we finish, that really get into this, the fortress moving out of the house of love and into the house of fear. And you told me it was written by an Israeli poet, and I'm way behind you in poetry. And you asked me, had I heard of him? And I said no. And then you said, well, he's very well known. And that made me feel very shameful that I was way behind you in my knowledge level about poetry.
I mean, to be clear, I was introduced to him 2 days ago, so I'm way ahead
good.
of you. Right.
Well, you didn't say that. Okay.
Can I respond to what you just said?
Of course.
I'll be super quick.
That's all right.
It was the Eugene Peterson quote this weekend.
Yeah.
And I don't have it memorized, but it is the very thing. I think when I hear that and I hear what you just said, it's the same thing. Like, this is not like there are no truths, there are no real, no, they absolutely are. But it's bigger than we think. I think that's the way I would say it. And there's more freedom. And I wish I had it at my fingertips. I was so touched by it. I had been driving the staff crazy trying to find the quote.
I can pull it up in my phone in a minute if we want to. If it's one of my favorite, I've got lots of favorite verses in the Bible. One of my favorites is in Psalm 18. It says, Lord, you loved me, you rescued me, and you led me into a spacious place. I mean, the poetry and the beauty and the imaginative invitation of those words. You loved me, you rescued me, and you led me into a spacious place. Just incredible. Anything more you want to say about that? we can talk a little bit about your own journey.
Okay. No, I'm good with that.
Would you be willing to share what you're comfortable with in terms of your current health journey?
Sure. So last October, I come home from a day at work and I sit down on the couch, and the long and the short of it is I found out like 3 or 4 days later, I had a seizure that was caused by a glioblastoma and somewhere up in here. So about a week later, I'm in surgery and they're taking that out. And ever since then, I have been being treated for that brain cancer. Glioblastoma, for context, the math geek in me comes out. It's the survivability is on a normal distribution curve. The median, the mean, they're all exactly the same. And so the 50% is kind of like the median life expectancy is 12 months from diagnosis. Lots of other factors that come into play here. But ordinarily, I mean, the long and the short of it is like I have a clear idea of what my lowercase t timeline is than I did before last October. I'm being treated, and so that's where we are.
So for people who maybe are a little bit curious, so the word glioblastoma, this is a form of cancer, and it generally has its first manifestation as brain cancer. There is not currently a known cure for it. You know that. And so I know you've always been literary. You've always been a thoughtful person. You've always written. Your entry a couple weeks ago was a copy and paste from a journal entry from a few years back with Caring for Abby. Mm-hmm. So this journaling, writing has, been a part of your life. But about, 5 months ago, you started writing regular entries. I read them on Substack. They also show up in my email. These entries are reflections that come from they come from you, which I'm hoping everybody's like, okay, now when they say it comes from you, and that you is Chris Rhoden, this is a remarkably thoughtful, smart person who considers things both in the richest of fare that is philosophically abstract. In other words, that it takes us to the deepest beauty. Also, the quantifiable scientific understanding of things, right? Then you add a person who is literary and loves words, and also is pretty engaged with poetry. I don't think I ever really appreciated poetry until probably 7 or 8 years ago when I began to, if I could say it as a confession, take it seriously. Mm-hmm. And so I'm catching up to poets and people who appreciate poetry. So if you're hearing this and you're curious, you can go on Substack and find Chris Rhoden's entries. They're not tweets. They'll take
they're not tweets.
They'll take 10 minutes mm-hmm. to read them. But if you really want to pay attention to them, when I'm able to focus on them, I'm going to read it 2 or 3 times. And I'm going to go back into what did this poem say and what was it conveying and what was it expressing. There are a number of people around here who I think have spoken to you, but they speak to me and they'll say, did you see Chris's recent posting? And they'll say, it's just remarkable the way he articulates faith, life, the journey, all of that. So where are you in articulating your relationship with God and this cancer at this place in your life?
I was just having this conversation with a new friend the other day, and we were talking about how
You always mention a friend that's like sort of the anonymous person in your writings.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's a literary tool or what it is.
Well, I kind of want it to be, I want everybody to think it's them. I honestly, if I'm going to be completely honest,
That's
like
great.
I want people to think I'm talking to them. But we were having this conversation, I think yesterday, maybe the day before. This is going to take some time for me to, I'll be as brief as I can, but to be able to articulate this. No, I know what I'm going to use. I'm going to use this metaphor. I used it yesterday. It's completely different. But like, I do kind of believe that I used to use this in my practice a lot. And I think there's a certain beauty to it. I think that, like, I want you to imagine young David Dwight, very young David Dwight, maybe 3 years old, and you're out on a beach walking somewhere and you've got a little blue plastic pail, right?
Mm-hmm.
And inside that pail, I don't know what it is, but maybe you do. It's like your most prized possession that you had when you were 2 or 3 years old. Maybe, I have no idea what that means, but I think you probably have some idea what it is.
Would have been my stuffed animal. That was my favorite stuffed animal when I was that age.
And you're walking down the beach, and you'll understand the metaphor immediately, and you start like picking stuff up as you go down the beach. Like, here's a shell, and that's really pretty, and you put it in there. And here's some sand you'd never seen before. And you just keep walking. You just keep picking up all this stuff. And you don't even notice it at first, but before long, that bucket gets really, really, really heavy. And that stuffed animal is buried underneath all those things. All of them. But you don't even notice it because you're just carrying it. You just keep walking. You just keep walking.
And each additional thing is only a gradual increase in the weight.
It's just a little bit at a time. Well, to me, what those life quakes are, they're an invitation to take that bucket and to take that little sifter that you've been carrying along all that time and just start dumping the stuff in there and let it wash out. And if you were to ask me, and like, this is a Kathleen Norris thing. I know we've talked about, Kathleen Norris talks about the gift of crisis. And we've talked, I think you and I may have talked about this idea that crisis comes from the Greek word of sift.
Yeah.
And it so deeply resonates, this idea, like when you're handed a crisis, it's an invitation to take that bucket and all that sand and all that stuff that you've been accumulating and put it in there and shake it off. And to be reminded of what was in that thing at the very beginning, that thing that is most valuable to you.
Yeah.
And to me, like, I'm kind of a slow learner, right? And what I mean by slow learner, I've had a lot.
Which is a ridiculous statement. But anyway, go ahead. Like Chris Rhoden's a slow learner. Okay, keep going.
Well, slow learner in the respect that, like, it took a number of crises to kind of understand what was going on. Because I think what would happen was, okay, like when Abby got sick, like, I'm going to manage this. I'm going to manage it. I'm going to make it right. I'm going to fix it. And like, you're a father, right? You're a father. Mm-hmm. You have one job to protect your children.
Yeah.
One job. And no. So there's a crisis. But I'm telling you, I doubled down. I'm going to control everything. I'm going to do all the research. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that, until my 26-year-old daughter kind of like put me in check and said, how about we just go live instead? Let the doctors be the doctors. And it was kind of a stunning thing to hear from a 26-year-old.
How about if we go live what?
We'll live and we'll let the doctors be the doctors. Uh-huh. She didn't say it in quite those terms, but it was kind of the idea of like, you can't control this. Uh-huh. So we can spend the time that I have left in fear, trying to manage everything that's going to happen, or we can accept the gift of life that we've been given. And this is why I say I'm a slow learner. It's like, okay, got it. How do we do this? And so now like I'm rolling up my sleeves, and how do we do this? And there is no how. That's one. And then I can keep going through a number of these life quakes. I really love that term, by the way. So I'm going to hold on to this whole idea of life quakes. And it's like one by one by one by one. Like the next thing that we think is, like, I'm not going to lie. I mean, okay, well, you know what? I might lose this. I might lose this. I might lose this. But I still have my body. My body's in pretty good shape. And then it's not. Well, that's okay. I still have, like, we've all been given a brain. And like, it's kind of like the last great irony. Like, that's the last thing that goes into this. I mean, I don't know where this is going to end up, but it's like this invitation. It's more than an invitation. It's like this encouragement to say, no, I want you to abandon yourself to me. I just want you to abandon yourself and trust me. I got you. You know, it's not about your brain. It's not about your body. It's not about how good you are as a father or a husband or a breadwinner or any of those things. Do you trust me or don't you? And I'm not going to sit here and I don't play this game that says, okay, well, God said, well, Chris isn't paying attention. Let's get his brain next. I don't believe that at all.
Right.
But it's not lost on me, this idea that, like, this is the invitation, just to surrender and complete trust. And of course, I'm not there. I mean, I'm not there. I still want to manage things. But I do think in some ways, like, the invitation has been extended. And I want to believe that I'm learning to accept that invitation. Mm. Does that make sense to you?
Of course, yes. Yes. There would be a long legacy of Christian voices who would say there are many gifts available with suffering and hardship. Mm-hmm. And one of the many is that we become freed from many of the things that bound us previously, many of the things to which we were beholden or wrapped around the axle, whatever word you want to use. You become freed. That kind of freedom is a glorious freedom. If we are on this progress journey of trusting God and being freed, an ultimate expression of trusting God and being freed is being freed of the fear of death. Paul writes in Corinthians, in a sense, that death is kind of the last enemy, the big thing. If we could be freed of the fear of death, that's a glorious freedom, and God would like us to be freed of that. The resurrection of Christ and so many other things that he's given us, and so much New Testament content leads us to God's desire that we would be freed of that. We could go back to things like sort of the primal psychological brain, and we are wired for life and survival, which I think is all true. Mm-hmm. But imagine not being afraid of death. And me hearing some of what you're saying is that suffering enables us to die to a lot of things that had a bondage upon us, mm-hmm. to help us toward the possibility of being freed of the ultimate bondage, which is the fear of death. You articulate this in various ways in your entries that are deep and meaningful, and people receive them with great thoughtfulness and receptivity. It is one thing to say, don't be afraid of dying. It is a very, very other thing to have all of the emotional inward composition of actually not being afraid of dying. one of the many gifts that you're giving to a lot of people is you're providing thoughts to help people address that journey. And that's remarkable. How about if I read this poem? Would that be okay?
Sure.
That
Yes.
we talked about? This poem that, by the way, is very familiar, and I'm sure you all already know it. But I got to find it now because I just looked it up. Okay. Why don't you read it? You have it, and you're the one who brought it to our attention. So I'm going to introduce it. This poem is called The Place Where We Are Right, and it's by an Israeli poet named Yehuda Amichai.
Okay. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood.
From our conversation today, when I think of the ruined house, I'm going to think of that big fortress house that you were mentioning that we build with our fears. Any other thoughts on your mind that you have that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Just gratitude. I guess that's the thing. I'm grateful. Well, I mean, let's be honest. I just like having conversations with you. So that's part of the deal here, too.
Well, that's the beauty of next week. We're going to have plenty of time for that.
Yes. So what you said at the end, it really touched me, honestly. Like, I can't imagine, like I want you to imagine, like, somebody saying something like that to you. Like, how would that land? Like, this idea that, like, somehow you get to, and I might not say the words exactly right, but you get to play a part in people coming to accept or come to peace with the inevitability of their death. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, I guess that's what you do, but it's such a beautiful idea. I mean, it really is. It's very touching. And sometimes I'm kind of astounded. And I think it's all of us. It's not me. Doesn't make us special. But the fact that like the God of the universe would like let us play a little part in his great orchestra just blows me away. It just blows me away.
Mm-hmm.
So
thank you for today. I want to close by saying I'm mindful of other people in your life who are very close to you. Catherine, your sons, other family members who are very close to you. And I don't really know how to articulate it, but I think about them a lot. We're here having this conversation, and there are a lot of people who love you, but these are people who are closest to you. And I don't really know what I'm saying. I'm just very mindful of them while we're having this conversation here. And I say that meaning I'm mindful of them with deep appreciation.
thank you.
For who they are to you, for who you are to them, for the depth of your family ties and love, as well as the journey that you all have been through over the last number of years with losing Abby. So I just want to say that I'm really mindful of them.
Thank you.
Thanks for this conversation today. All right, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. This is one of our longer HOPECASTs, and hope that you've enjoyed it. Hope Church in Richmond, Virginia is a place where we're trying to help people find life in Jesus Christ and faith and freedom and love and all the things that we've been talking about today. So if you're curious and you want to know more, you can find Hope at Hope Church RVA. on the internet, and you can also find our podcasts on most of the podcast platforms, the HOPECAST and a few other, the FAMcast that's part of Hope's Life, as well as Hope Sermons. Thanks for being with us today. We hope you enjoyed it and hope you found it helpful and meaningful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.